Class is in session, and the subject is hydropower.
Welcome back to Hydro 101, everyone's favorite and only mini-series of DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. Podcaster I may be, but podcast engineer I am not. And for those of you who like to tune into the DAM podcast on the date of release, I apologize that this one's coming to you a bit late. We are having some technical difficulties here at the DAM HQ studio, and unfortunately, my normal microphone is not working at all. So I am recording on the internal microphone on my laptop. I hope the sound quality isn't too atrocious in this case, and we will do our best to continue forward with the podcast as scheduled. Now, going back to Hydro 101, what this podcast aims to do is break down the complexities of hydropower at a basic level and help you better understand how our favorite energy resource works. As always, I remind everyone that these podcasts are meant to cover topics at a very basic level. We aren't going to get too deep into the weeds or dive into specifics because that's what the regular episodes of DAM serve to do. These podcasts should help listeners get up to speed on topics we regularly cover and fill in knowledge gaps to provide better context for our regular discussions. They can also serve as an excellent educational resource for introducing someone to hydropower in an audio format. Today, we're going to do something slightly different, though, than we've done with previous episodes of Hydro 101, and instead explore the history of where we are today and how we got here. More specifically, we'll look at the history of how hydropower came to represent half of the Northwest's total energy supply. Trust me when I say there is a wealth of rich information and history surrounding hydropower, especially in our own backyard. There are entire books written about just specific moments within that history. In fact, back on episode 8 of the podcast with Ted Case, we discussed some of his own published work on hydro and public power, and I'd encourage you to give that a listen and check out his books as well if you're interested. As for this episode, it was difficult to determine how to approach this, but I'll try my best over the next few minutes to try to capture what happened, when it happened, and briefly explore why it happened. The history of Northwest Hydropower really starts wherever you want it to start. Was it the discovery of electricity, the harnessing of rivers' current to accomplish other tasks, or observing the mighty beaver and building his home? Again, you can decide for yourself. What we do know is that hydroelectric dams really started appearing in the Northwest in the late 1800s, but the projects we're most familiar with today came to be during the 1930s specifically. During this period, Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam were constructed and began producing power for the region. That just so happens to take place in a very important time for America, as the country was in between two world wars and in the midst of the Great Depression. In an effort to recover the economy from the Depression and restore prosperity to the country, then President Franklin D. Roosevelt enacted the New Deal. Throughout the 1930s, federal programs put people to work and led to incredible public works projects. Grand Coulee Dam was one such project. Following decades of demand for rural communities in eastern Washington to secure irrigation for farming, FDR approved the $63 million necessary to build the dam. The project employed thousands with good-paying jobs and strengthened central Washington's economy in ways that we can still see the results of today. Grand Coulee Dam was one such project. Following decades of demand from rural communities in eastern Washington to secure irrigation for farming, FDR approved the $63 million necessary to build the dam, with an emphasis on making sure that it provided hydropower as well. The project employed thousands with good-paying jobs and strengthened Central Washington's economy in ways that we can still see the results of today. In the end, Grand Coulee became the largest concrete structure in the United States, even still today, and is one of the most productive hydroelectric dams worldwide, with a generating capacity of nearly 7,000 megawatts. Grand Coulee's reservoir is also essential to flood control and energy storage capabilities in our region. Of course, the dam came at a cost, and not just in terms of dollars. For the prosperity that it brought, it also upset the lives of others. Nearby communities and farms and tribal nations were disrupted, and in some cases uprooted, and Grand Coulee's tremendous size prevented the build-out of upstream fish passage. On episode 28, we discussed a historical fiction novel on this exact subject, titled The Grand Promise, with author Rebecca Anderson. The overwhelming benefits of Grand Coulee are undeniable, and it is still hugely important to the Northwest today. And efforts to rectify some of the negative consequences of the project are still underway. This includes an important undertaking by the Upper Columbia United Tribes to reintroduce Chinook salmon above Grand Coulee, bringing spawning adults into the stretch of the mainstream Upper Columbia known as Lake Roosevelt, and helping ensure their offspring can make their downstream journey to the ocean. This project has been strongly supported by Northwest River partners and public power in the region, and shows promise for salmon to make a comeback to the Upper Columbia. Further downstream of Grand Coulee, another New Deal project was underway. Starting around the same time, in 1933, and beginning operation in 1938, Bonneville Dam, located just east of Portland, Oregon, was the first federal lock and dam constructed on the Columbia. Notably, the word lock is included because, unlike Grand Coulee, Bonneville would provide river navigation benefits in addition to generating energy and controlling for floods. The completion of this lock made obsolete the nearby lock at Cascade Rapids, which began operation in 1896. Today, you can still visit the site in Cascade Locks. Like Grand Coulee, Bonneville employed thousands, cost millions, and resulted in a productive dam that we still rely on today. It should be noted, though, that Bonneville Dam wasn't truly completed in 1938. Where the dam was constructed, the Columbia is split really in three different directions by two islands, and so Bonneville, in a sense, is actually three separate dams. The second powerhouse within the project wasn't completed until 1982, and a second lock was added in 1993. Bonneville also includes fish passage, and became an important site for studying migration of salmon and the impact of hydropower on fish. Today, you can visit the hatchery at Bonneville Dam, and see the fish ladders in action at the Visitor Center, and if you get a chance, I strongly recommend you do so. Importantly, both Bonneville and Grand Coulee were part of a larger New Deal effort to not only provide hydropower and create some amazing public works projects that would employ people, but also transform the country through something called rural electrification. Through the Rural Electrification Administration and the Rural Electrification Act, efforts to supply energy to remote areas of the country were undertaken. Of course, that meant we needed electricity to supply them, and these new hydroelectric projects could do exactly that. These two New Deal efforts, hydropower and rural electrification together, led to the formation of the Bonneville Power Administration, who today distributes and sells the energy generated by the Northwest Federal Hydropower System to the not-for-profit community-owned public power utilities that were formed during the rural electrification movement as well. The Northwest as we know it, with its robust public power and low energy costs, is the direct result of decisions made during this important period. These two dams we've discussed so far also arrived just in time to bring vital energy to the region during World War II, providing energy for aluminum to build planes, ships, and much more. So what about all those other dams, right? We have a tremendous system that we talk about so often. Well, you may be surprised to learn that actually neither Grand Coulee or Bonneville were truly the first dam to span the Columbia. Yes, Bonneville holds the title as the first federal dam, but Puget Sound Power and Light's privately owned Rock Island Dam, located just downstream of Wenatchee, Washington, was completed in 1932. 2 decades later, in 1955, Chelan PUD acquired Rock Island Dam. In 1956, Chelan PUD began construction on a second dam north of Wenatchee named Rocky Reach, which was completed in 1961. There are, in fact, a number of public power-owned dams, and we'll get to those later on. Returning to the timeline of events, the 1940s see a pause in large federal hydropower projects on the Columbia River. Of course, there are dams on tributaries throughout the Columbia River Basin and elsewhere in the Northwest, but there are literally hundreds to cover with varying degrees of significance, which presents a challenge for a podcast like this. What we are primarily focusing on, of course, is the federal system and the privately owned dams, or I guess public power owned dams, that are linked into that system as well on the main stem parts of the river. Now, a number of factors contributed to this pause in dam building, but obviously the largest was the country's focus on the war effort. During this time, the Northwest attracted a significant workforce to support manufacturing. Housing this workforce and the rapidly growing population created by it led to some challenges, and from this came the town of Vanport. Located between Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington, in the modern-day Delta Park area, Vanport housed many of these wartime workers, especially those employed at nearby shipyards. To say Vanport has a controversial history would be an understatement, and that history isn't necessarily relevant to today's topic of hydropower specifically, but it should be noted that there was much racial tension, segregation, and discrimination intertwined in the history of this short-lived community. It was short-lived because Vanport was constructed in 1942, and following the war, its population shrunk substantially. Shortly after that shrinkage, in May of 1948, disaster struck. A warm, wet spring saw the Columbia River surge. With the combined precipitation and the melting of snowpack and the warmer temperatures, the Columbia River was enormously overflowing, and the levee separating Vanport from the river, which actually Vanport sat below the water level of the river, it could only take so much. On the afternoon of Memorial Day, the levee gave way and the flooding began with very little notice to residents. 15 people in total lost their lives, but around 18,000 were left homeless. Had it not been for this event, which wiped out Vanport entirely and brought flooding to other communities throughout the region as well, Congress may have not drafted or passed the Flood Control Act of 1950, but instead, the act was passed, and dam building in the region exploded as a result. McNary Dam was the first to come online in 1954, followed by Chief Joseph in 1955 and the Dalles in 1957. Then came the aforementioned Rocky Reach, along with Grant PUD's Priest Rapids Dam in 1961, which was originally a federal dam, actually. Upstream of Priest Rapids, Grant PUD's Wanapum Dam was completed in 1963. Then nearby Douglas PUD's Wells Dam arrived in 1967. The final dam on the Columbia River, John Day, was operational beginning in 1971. And further north, Canada's Columbia River projects, owned by BC Hydro, were constructed between 1968 and 1984. Significant projects on the Snake River started during this period as well, as the Snake River is the largest tributary to the Columbia. Idaho Power's Hells Canyon complex of dams were constructed from 1959 to 1967, and the federal lower Snake River dams started with Ice Harbor in 1961, Lower Monumental in 1969, Little Goose in 1970, and Lower Granite in 1975. With the completion of these large-scale projects throughout the region, hydropower surged to provide the Northwest with a significant amount of energy and better control over the river system. Navigation locks on the Lower Columbia and Lower Snake created a marine highway for barging to transport goods, and irrigation boosted agriculture and provided drinking water to growing communities. And, of course, flooding disasters could be better prevented. What wasn't known at the time was that these projects would eventually contribute to our current clean energy goals, but today we reap those benefits as well. Like Grand Coulee, these dams didn't come without their drawbacks. Again, local communities, and especially tribes, were impacted by the impoundment of the river and the changes it created. Places like Celilo Falls, for example, an important salmon harvesting site for Northwest tribal nations, disappeared altogether underneath the rising water. These decades-old impacts are still the subject of controversy and debate today, though work continues to try to find solutions where possible. Importantly, dams on the lower and mid-Columbia and lower Snake include vital fish passage for migrating salmon. Like the dams themselves, fish passage infrastructure continues to improve to this day. You can listen to more on that subject on the previous episode of Hydro 101, along with episodes of Dam, including our most recent, with Gia Schneider from Natel, the makers of fish-safe turbines. Looking back on this era of dam building, there are also many policies that were enacted to support and manage these resources as well. These policies cemented the relationships we see today between federal agencies that own and operate many of these dams and the public power utilities that serve communities across the Northwest. This period also led to the first Columbia River Treaty between the US and Canada, and renegotiations on that treaty are taking place as of the recording of this podcast. It's easy to reflect on this timeline of events and gloss over a lot of it, especially in this brief and condensed format I'm bringing it to you today. But I encourage you to reflect on the decades of policymaking, construction, and work that took place over decades, generations, and administrations to bring us to where we are today. Now, years beyond the era of dam building, we are the beneficiaries of these resources and the investments that were made. We receive half of all of our energy from hydropower, which mostly comes from the dams that were mentioned today in particular, and they play a critical role in our everyday lives, from agriculture and labor to recreation and navigation. We also enjoy a robust, reliable supply of clean energy and the lowest electricity rates in the nation. As we've discussed on Dam, however, the demand for energy is rapidly growing, and while another era of dam building is unlikely to ever happen in our lifetimes, we may need a major public works effort of this nature to build the resources we need in the time frame we need them by. If you're fascinated by history as I am, you may feel there is still a lot left on the table after listening today. And you're completely right. As I said at the start of this, there are entire books dedicated to some of the events I called out or names I mentioned during this. Don't let that get you down that this podcast didn't cover those in depth, though. Rather, let this be the starting point for you to dive deeper and research these topics at length. And likewise, I'll be looking for opportunities for some history experts to take us on some deeper dives on these events as well. There are also incredible resources out there that have documented much of this history, and I feel they deserve some credit. Many of the public utilities themselves, federal agencies including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Bonneville Power Administration, and the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council have some excellent resources available. You can also find valuable resources throughout the Northwest's colleges, and from organizations including our friends at the Foundation for Water and Energy Education, also known as FWE. At the end of all of this, what I hope that you'll take away is a better picture of how and why hydropower became a dominant force in the Northwest, and what motivated us to embark on the era, or eras, of dam building. This podcast also aims to celebrate the unsung heroes of hydropower, and there are literally a countless number of people responsible for building these projects and working to provide a better future for generations to come. Understanding this history and the tremendous human investment helps me better appreciate these resources and feel the same passion so many of this industry do, and I hope you all feel similarly. History also helps us recognize the root of the challenges that we face today and how we can learn from mistakes made to avoid repeating them in the future. Of course, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast and gained something valuable from it. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform, subscribing to DAM, and turning on notifications so you'll know when we upload episodes every other Friday. We always want to be a resource, so please reach out to us using the contact form on nwriverpartners.org if you want to discuss hydro history some more. We're also happy to take your questions and feedback, as well as suggestions on future episodes, topics, and guests. Likewise, you can email us directly at info@nwriverpartners.org. And finally, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X at NW River Partners. Our next episode of the regular DAM podcast arrives in 2 weeks from the date of uploading this, which means this episode of Hydro 101 is now History 2. So, until next time, see you.